The cruelest betrayals come from those who should love us most. A mother dragging her pregnant daughter to market, trading her child's future for 30 pieces of silver. It's the kind of heartbreak that makes even kings question their faith in humanity. Alpha King Ronan had ruled the kingdom of Valdris for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything as devastating as the 18-year-old girl standing on the auction block. Elira was heavy with child, abandoned by her own mother, and trembling, like a leaf in the wind. The king bought her out of anger at the world's cruelty, not knowing this single act would change everything. An ancient prophecy had cursed his bloodline. No child of his would ever survive. But when strange signs begin appearing around Elira's unborn baby, Ronan wonders if fate has finally decided to show mercy. Could this frightened girl and her child be the miracle he'd stopped believing in? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The castle of Valdris stood like a weathered sentinel against the grey morning sky, its ancient stones bearing the weight of centuries and the sorrows of kings. From his chamber window, Alpha King Ronan gazed out at the kingdom he had protected. For 15 years, his weathered hands gripping the stone sill with the same intensity that had once wielded a sword in countless battles. At 35, his dark hair was already touched with silver at the temples, and deep lines marked his face, not from age, but from the burden of ruling a cursed bloodline. The crown of thorns sat heavily on the oak table behind him, its blackened metal twisted into cruel spirals that had adorned the heads of his ancestors for 3 centuries. Each thorn represented a life lost, an heir who had perished before their first breath, and a dream that had withered in the cradle. Ronan had worn it for 15 years, feeling its weight grow heavier with each passing season of solitude. Your Majesty. The voice belonged to Marcus, his most trusted advisor, a man whose loyalty had been forged in the fires of war and tempered by years of faithful service. Marcus entered the chamber with the careful steps of someone who understood the delicate balance of approaching a king lost in thought. "She's settled in the east wing," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "The girl you brought from the market yesterday. The servants are asking questions." Ronan turned from the window, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the weight of his decision. "Let them ask. What would you have me do, Marcus? Leave her there to be torn apart by wolves in men's clothing?" "Of course not, my lord. But purchasing a pregnant Omega at auction raises certain expectations among the court. They assume you intend to claim her child as your own." The king's jaw tightened. "My own bloodline is cursed. Every child born to a king of Valdris dies before their first year. The prophecy has held true for 300 years. Why would I doom an innocent child to that fate?" Marcus moved closer, his weathered face showing the concern of a man who had watched his king struggle with loneliness for far too long. "Perhaps that's exactly why the gods placed her in your path. Sometimes mercy leads us where duty cannot." In the east wing of the castle, Elira sat on the edge of a bed far softer than any she had ever known, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. The room was beautiful, beyond anything she had imagined. Tapestries depicting scenes of ancient glory hung from the walls, and thick carpets covered floors of polished stone. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that should have been comforting, but only reminded her of how far she was from anything familiar. She was 18 years old, and had never spent a night away from the small cottage where she had grown up. Her mother's betrayal still burned in her chest like a physical wound. The memory of those cold eyes counting silver coins while her own daughter stood chained and helpless would haunt her dreams for years to come. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss?" The voice belonged to a woman, kind and patient. "May I come in?" "Yes," Elira whispered, barely trusting her voice. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, with gentle brown eyes and greying hair pinned back neatly. Her dress marked her as upper household staff, but her manner was warm and motherly. "I'm Catherine, the head housekeeper. I've brought you some clothes and a meal. You must be hungry." Elira nodded, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she had eaten. Catherine set down a tray laden with bread, cheese, fruit, and warm soup that filled the room with savory aromas. Then she laid out a simple but well-made dress of soft blue wool. "The king asked me to see to your comfort," Catherine said, her voice carefully neutral. "Is there anything you need? Anything that might help you settle in?" "I don't understand why I'm here," Elira said quietly. "Why did he buy me? What does he want from me?" Catherine's expression softened with something that might have been maternal sympathy. "His Majesty didn't tell me his reasons, dear, but I've served in this castle for 30 years, and I've never seen him show kindness without cause. Perhaps you should ask him yourself." The afternoon sun was slanting through the tall windows of the great hall when Ronan finally encountered Elira again. She stood near one of the massive pillars that supported the vaulted ceiling, looking small and lost in the cavernous space. The blue dress Catherine had provided suited her far better than the rough cloth she had worn at the auction, and for the first time he could see past the fear and desperation to the young woman beneath. "You look better," he said, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "Are the accommodations suitable?" Elira turned to face him, and he was struck by the intelligence in her green eyes. Fear was still there, but it was tempered now by curiosity and something that might have been determination. "Why did you buy me?" she asked directly, echoing the question she had posed to Catherine. The directness surprised him. In his experience, people approached kings with elaborate courtesy and careful words. Her bluntness was refreshing, even if the question cut to the heart of his own uncertainty. "Because no one else should have," he said simply. "Because leaving you there would have been wrong, and I've done enough wrong things in my life to know the difference." "But what do you want from me?" she pressed. "People don't spend gold on nothing. There are expectations." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "I want nothing from you that you're not willing to give," he said finally. "You're under my protection now. That means you're safe, you're fed, you have a place to sleep, and no one in this kingdom can harm you. In return, I ask only that you don't give me cause to regret my decision and my child." The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Ronan felt the familiar ache in his chest, the longing for something he had convinced himself was impossible. "Your child will be under my protection as well," he said carefully. "Whatever bloodline runs in their veins, they will be safe here." That evening, as the castle settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Ronan found himself in the library, surrounded by ancient texts and prophecies that had shaped his family's fate for centuries. The prophecy was clear. No true-born child of his bloodline would live to see their first year. It was why he had never taken a wife, never allowed himself to hope for an heir. The curse was absolute, and he had accepted his role as the last king of his line. But as he sat in the flickering candlelight, his thoughts kept returning to the young woman sleeping in the east wing. There was something about her that he couldn't name, something that made the ancient words on the pages before him seem less certain than they had for 15 years. Marcus found him there near midnight, still poring over the same passages he had read 1,000 times before. "You're thinking about the prophecy," Marcus observed, settling into a chair across from his king. "I'm thinking about many things," Ronan replied, not looking up from the ancient text. "Did you ever wonder if we might have misunderstood something? If there might be more to the words than we realized?" "I've wondered many things over the years," Marcus said carefully. "But I've also watched you carry this burden alone for 15 years. Perhaps it's time you allowed yourself to hope for something different." "Hope is a luxury kings cannot afford," Ronan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Hope is what separates kings from tyrants," Marcus countered gently. "And that girl in the East Wing has already changed something in this castle. The servants speak of it. There's a lightness in the air that hasn't been here for years." Ronan finally looked up from the book, meeting his old friend's steady gaze. She's carrying another man's child, Marcus. Even if the prophecy could be broken, it wouldn't be by a bastard heir with no royal blood. Are you so certain about that? Marcus asked. Sometimes the gods work in ways we don't expect. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. As the night deepened and the castle grew quiet, both men sat in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts of prophecies and possibilities. While in the east wing, Elira lay awake, one hand on her belly, wondering what strange twist of fate had brought her to this place and what tomorrow would bring. The ancient stones of Valdris had witnessed many things over the centuries: wars and peace, triumph and tragedy, the rise and fall of kings. But they had never witnessed anything quite like this: a cursed king and a frightened girl, both carrying secrets that would reshape the kingdom's destiny if either of them was brave enough to believe in miracles. 3 days after Elira's arrival, at the castle the oracle came. She appeared at the gates like a figure from legend, her ancient frame bent beneath the weight of countless years, her blind eyes milky white and yet somehow seeing more than any mortal should. The guards who escorted her spoke in hushed tones of how she had simply materialized on the road, as if the earth itself had given birth to prophecy. Ronan received her in the throne room, the crown of thorns heavy upon his brow. The oracle moved. With surprising grace for one so old, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. In her gnarled hands she carried something that made the very air hum with power. The prophecy stone, an obsidian tablet carved with runes so ancient that their meaning had been lost to all but a chosen few. "You have done something that changes the very fabric of fate," the oracle said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The stones speak of it. The winds whisper of it. The stars themselves have shifted in their courses. Speak." "Plainly, wise one," Ronan commanded, though his voice carried respect rather than authority. "What brings you to my hall?" The oracle lifted the prophecy stone, and immediately the ancient runes began to glow with an eerie blue light. The temperature in the great hall dropped perceptibly, and several of the assembled courtiers took involuntary steps backward. "The girl you brought into your household carries more than just a child in her womb," the oracle intoned, her sightless eyes fixed on something beyond the physical realm. "She carries the key to either your salvation or your absolute destruction." Marcus stepped forward from his position near the throne. "What do you mean?" "The prophecy has been clear for 3 centuries. No heir of the royal line will survive their first year." The oracle's laugh was like the sound of autumn leaves rustling in a graveyard. "Foolish men, reading only the surface of divine will. The prophecy speaks of heirs of the royal line, yes, but it says nothing of heirs who might join that line through different means." "You're speaking in riddles," Ronan said, though his heart had begun to beat faster. "If you have knowledge, share it clearly." The prophecy stone pulsed brighter, and the runes seemed to shift and dance across its surface. "The child she carries is touched by old magic, magic that predates your curse by millennia. But beware, King of Valdris, for the same power that might break your chains could also forge new ones. The choice will come, and when it does, you must choose not with your crown, but with your heart." "What choice?" Ronan demanded, rising from his throne. "What must I choose between?" But the oracle was already turning away, the light fading from the stone. "That which comes naturally to those who rule, and that which comes only to those who love. Watch the girl closely, King. The signs are already beginning." As if summoned by the oracle's words, a commotion arose from the castle's corridors. Guards rushed into the hall, their faces pale with alarm. "Your Majesty," one of them gasped, "you must come quickly. It's the girl. Something's happening in the east wing." Ronan ran through the corridors faster than he had moved since his days as a young warrior. Behind him, Marcus and several guards struggled to keep pace. The oracle, despite her apparent frailty, moved with them as if carried by the wind itself. They found Elira in the castle's garden courtyard, a space enclosed by high walls and normally visited only by the gardeners. She stood in the center of the carefully tended space, her face tilted toward the sky, seemingly unaware of the chaos around her. Every flower in the garden was blooming, not just the roses and lilies that should have been in season, but everything. Spring bulbs that should have been dormant, autumn chrysanthemums, even the old oak tree that hadn't leafed properly in 5 years was suddenly full of vibrant green foliage. "How long has she been like this?" Ronan asked Catherine, who stood at a safe distance with several other servants, all staring in wonder and fear. "About an hour, Your Majesty," Catherine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She came out here after the midday meal, said she needed fresh air. Then this started happening. We tried to approach her, but there's some sort of barrier. We can't get close." Ronan could see it now, a faint shimmer in the air around Elira, like heat rising from summer stone. The very air seemed to dance with energy, and when he tried to step forward, he felt resistance, as if the atmosphere itself had become solid. "She's not in pain," he observed, noting the peaceful expression on her face. "Whatever this is, it's not harming her." The oracle stepped forward, raising the prophecy stone once more. This time, the runes blazed so brightly that several people shielded their eyes. "The awakening has begun," she announced. "The child stirs in the womb, and ancient power recognizes its own. This is but the first sign, King of Valdris. There will be others, and each will be stronger than the last." As if responding to the oracle's words, Elira's eyes suddenly opened. They glowed with the same blue light as the prophecy stone, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The chains of blood will break when love proves stronger than law," she said, the words clearly, not her own. "The heir who is not born to the throne shall save the throne from its curse, but beware the price of prophecy fulfilled, for every miracle demands its sacrifice." Then she collapsed. Ronan moved without thinking, the strange barrier that had held him back suddenly gone. He caught her as she fell, her body limp and cold despite the warmth of the day. Her eyes had returned to their normal green, and she was unconscious but breathing steadily. "Catherine, fetch the castle physician," he commanded, lifting Elira carefully in his arms. "Now." As he carried her back into the castle, the oracle's words echoed in his mind. "The heir who is not born to the throne." The child Elira carried was not his, had no claim to royal blood, and yet somehow it might be the key to breaking a curse that had haunted his family for 3 centuries. That evening, as Elira rested under the physician's care, Ronan found himself back in the library, but this time he was not alone. The oracle sat across from him, the prophecy stone dark and silent on the table between them. "You have questions," she said without looking up from her own contemplation. "I have many questions," Ronan admitted, "but first, tell me about the child. What manner of power could cause what we witnessed today?" "Old power," the oracle replied. "Magic from the time before kings, before kingdoms, when the world was young and the barriers between realms were thin. The child she carries has been touched by that ancient force, marked for a destiny that even I cannot fully see. And if I accept this child as my heir, if I choose to believe in this prophecy?" The oracle finally looked at him, her blind eyes somehow seeing straight into his soul. "Then you must be prepared to love without reservation, to protect without question, and to sacrifice everything you thought you knew about what it means to be king. The choice, when it comes, will not be between power and weakness, Ronan of Valdris. It will be between the crown you wear and the man you truly are." Outside, night settled over the kingdom, but in the castle of Valdris, ancient powers were stirring, and the first chapter of a new prophecy had begun to write itself in fire and wonder. In the days following the oracle's visit, the castle of Valdris hummed with whispered conversations and sidelong glances. News of the miraculous blooming in the garden had spread through the halls like wildfire, and with it came speculation about the pregnant girl the king had brought into his household. Ronan found himself spending more time in the East Wing than protocol demanded, though he told himself it was merely to ensure Elira's recovery from her collapse. The physician had pronounced her healthy, the child strong, but the king sensed changes in her that went beyond the physical. There was a new awareness in her green eyes, as if she had seen something during her unconscious episode that had fundamentally altered her understanding of the world. "You don't remember anything?" he asked during one of his visits, settling into a chair beside her bed with less formality than he typically showed. Elira shook her head, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "It's like trying to remember a dream after waking. There are impressions, feelings, but nothing concrete. I remember being in the garden, enjoying the warmth of the sun, and then nothing until I woke up here." "The flowers bloomed," Ronan said quietly, "all of them, out of season. The gardeners say nothing like it has ever happened before." She looked at him with curiosity rather than fear, which surprised him. Most people would have been terrified to learn they were connected to something so unnatural. "Do you think it was because of me or because of the baby?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." From his doublet he withdrew a small object wrapped in silk. As he unfolded the cloth, moonlight from the window caught the surface of an ancient pendant, a piece that had belonged to his mother, carved from a single piece of luminous stone that seemed to hold light within its depths. "This was my mother's," he said, holding up the moonstone pendant. "It's said to offer protection to those who wear it, and to glow in the presence of magic. I'd like you to have it." Elira's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly accept something so precious." "You can and you will," he said firmly, but his tone was gentle. "Consider it a precaution. If strange things are going to continue happening around you, you should have every protection available." As he fastened the pendant around her neck, his fingers briefly brushed her skin, and both of them felt a spark of something that had nothing to do with magic. The pendant immediately began to glow with a soft, steady light, confirming what the oracle had suggested. Elira was indeed touched by forces beyond the ordinary. The court, meanwhile, was far from unanimous in its acceptance of the king's actions. In the great hall, nobles gathered in small clusters, their conversations carefully modulated but intense. Duke Aldrich, a man whose ambition had long exceeded his wisdom, was particularly vocal in his disapproval. "It's unseemly," he argued to anyone who would listen. "A king who buys pregnant slaves at market brings shame upon the crown, and now these wild stories about magic and prophecy. It's the talk of madmen." Lord Garrett, an older noble whose family had served the crown for generations, shook his head in disagreement. "His Majesty has always acted with honor. If he saw fit to show mercy to that girl, we should trust his judgment." "Mercy?" Duke Aldrich scoffed. "He's installed her in the palace like a mistress, given her fine clothes and a position of honor. For all we know, he intends to legitimize her bastard child and name it as his heir. It's an insult to every noble family in the kingdom." Marcus, who had been listening from across the hall, finally approached the group. His reputation as the king's most trusted advisor gave his words particular weight. "His Majesty's decisions are his own to make," he said quietly, but his voice carried the authority of years spent in the king's service. "And I would caution against spreading rumors about the young lady's circumstances. She is under royal protection, which means she is beyond reproach." Duke Aldrich's face flushed red. "Are you threatening me, Marcus?" "I'm reminding you of your place," Marcus replied evenly, "and suggesting that those who cannot support their king might find themselves more comfortable in their own estates, away from court." The warning was clear, but Aldrich's expression suggested the message had only fueled his resentment rather than quelling it. As the group dispersed, Marcus made a mental note to increase the guard presence around the East Wing. Political discontent had a way of turning dangerous when left unchecked. That same evening, Ronan found himself in his private chambers, staring at maps of the kingdom's borders. Reports from his scouts indicated unusual activity in the neighboring realm of Drakmor, troop movements that suggested either military exercises or preparation for something more serious. King Morteus of Drakmor had always been an ambitious ruler, held in check only by Valdris's superior military strength and strategic position. If word of strange happenings in the castle reached him, he might see it as a sign of weakness. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting Marcus with the evening reports. Instead, Elira stepped into the room, moving carefully but with determination. The moonstone pendant around her neck glowed softly in the lamplight, and she had regained much of her color since the incident in the garden. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for the pendant, for everything. Catherine told me about the court gossip. I know my presence here is causing problems for you." Ronan set down the maps and studied her face. "The court always finds something to gossip about. If it weren't you, it would be something else. But this is different," she pressed. "They think you're planning to claim my child as your heir. They think you're being foolish, letting sentiment override duty." "And what do you think?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for a moment, one hand unconsciously moving to her belly. "I think you're a good man trying to do right in a world that makes that difficult. But I also think you're lonelier than anyone realizes, and that might be clouding your judgment." Her honesty caught him off guard. In 15 years of rule, few people had spoken to him with such directness about personal matters. "Perhaps you're right," he said finally, "but perhaps that doesn't make my actions wrong. Sometimes the heart sees truths that the mind cannot accept. And sometimes the heart wants things so badly that it creates truths that don't exist," she replied gently. "I don't want to be the cause of your downfall, Your Majesty. If my being here threatens your kingdom, then perhaps I should leave." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he had intended. "You're under my protection, and that protection doesn't end because a few nobles are uncomfortable. Whatever is happening with your child, whatever power is awakening around you, we'll face it together." As she left his chambers that night, Ronan touched the maps on his desk and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would begin training with his sword again, readying himself for whatever battles lay ahead. Because if the oracle was right, if Elira's child truly was the key to breaking the curse, then there would be those who would try to stop it from happening, and he would be ready. The changes began subtly, noticed first by the servants who worked closest to Elira's daily routines. Catherine was the first to mention the healing crystal, a rare gemstone that had adorned the East Wing's mantelpiece for decades without anyone paying it much attention. The crystal had always been clear, valued more for its size and clarity than any mystical properties, but now it pulsed with a gentle inner light whenever Elira entered the room, growing brighter when she was content and dimming when she felt distressed. "It's as if the very stones of this castle are responding to her," Catherine confided to Marcus during one of their regular conversations about household matters. Yesterday, when she was feeling unwell from the pregnancy, the crystal barely glowed at all, but when she received that letter from your scholars about her reading lessons, it blazed like a star. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He had noticed changes throughout the castle, small things that might have been coincidental if taken individually, but which formed a pattern when considered together. Flowers lasting longer in their vases, food staying fresh past its usual time. Even the oldest servants reporting that their arthritis pains had lessened since Elira's arrival. "Has she noticed these effects herself?" Marcus asked. "I believe so, though she's careful not to mention them directly. She's a perceptive girl despite her youth. She understands that being seen as too unusual could be dangerous." Catherine's assessment proved accurate. Elira had indeed begun to notice the strange phenomena surrounding her, but she had also observed the growing tension in the castle. Some servants regarded her with something approaching reverence, while others crossed themselves and hurried past when they saw her coming. The court nobles were even more divided, their whispered conversations falling silent whenever she appeared. The First assassination attempt came on a Tuesday morning. Subtle and nearly successful, Elira had developed a routine of taking her morning meal in the small dining chamber adjacent to her rooms, enjoying the quiet and the view of the garden where she had experienced her first mysterious episode. On this particular morning, a new servant girl brought her breakfast, porridge with honey, fresh bread, and herbal tea that was supposed to help with the nausea of pregnancy. The tea tasted slightly bitter, but Elira attributed that to the herbs and drank it without suspicion. Within minutes, she felt dizzy and nauseous in a way that was different from her usual morning sickness. The healing crystal on the mantelpiece began to pulse erratically, its light flickering like a candle in the wind. Catherine, arriving for their daily discussion of household matters, found Elira collapsed over the table, barely conscious. The moonstone pendant around her neck was blazing with light so intense it was almost painful to look at. Poison, Catherine breathed, recognizing the signs from her years of experience in a noble household where such threats were always possible. She immediately sent for the castle physician while supporting Elira, whose breathing had become labored. The pendant's light seemed to be fighting something, pulsing in rhythm with Elira's heartbeat. Where it touched her skin, there was warmth that gradually spread through her body, counteracting whatever toxin had been introduced to her system. By the time Ronan arrived, summoned by Catherine's urgent message, Elira was conscious again, but weak. The physician confirmed the poison attempt, but marveled at how quickly she had recovered. "By rights, Your Majesty, she should be dead," he said quietly, out of Elira's hearing. The poison was subtle but lethal, designed to mimic the complications of pregnancy, but something fought it off, something I've never seen before. Ronan's face was granite as he processed this information. The servant who brought the meal disappeared. Immediately after serving it, Marcus reported grimly. "We're searching, but she's likely long gone. This was planned, coordinated. Someone wanted the girl dead and made it appear accidental." "Double the guard on the east wing," Ronan commanded. "And I want to know who in my court has been in contact with agents from outside the kingdom. This level of sophistication suggests foreign involvement." That evening, against Marcus's strong recommendations, Ronan visited Elira personally. He found her sitting by the window, the healing crystal glowing steadily on the table beside her, the moonstone pendant still faintly luminous against her throat. "Someone tried to kill me today," she said without preamble as he entered. "Someone in your own household." "We don't know that for certain," he replied, though his tone suggested he suspected the same thing. "The pendant saved my life, didn't it?" she continued, touching the stone gently. "And probably the baby's life too. These aren't just pretty ornaments you've given me. They're protection against something specific." Ronan sat across from her, abandoning royal formality in favor of honesty. "I believe your child may be the key to breaking the curse that has plagued my bloodline for 3 centuries. If that's true, there are those who would see you both dead rather than allow that prophecy to be fulfilled. Why would anyone want to preserve a curse? Because some people profit from chaos and weakness. If Valdris has no clear heir, if the crown becomes vulnerable, neighboring kingdoms might see opportunities for expansion. And within our own borders, there are nobles who believe they could rule better than I do." Elira was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "So my child isn't just special because of what it might become. It's also a threat to people who benefit from the current situation." "Exactly." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Which is why I need you to trust me completely. No food from anyone except Catherine or the physician. No walks alone, no unescorted trips anywhere in the castle. I know it seems like a prison. It's not a prison if you're choosing to stay," she interrupted. "And I am choosing to stay, Your Majesty. For the first time in my life, I feel like I have a purpose beyond just surviving. If my child can break your family's curse, if it can bring hope to this kingdom, then protecting it is the most important thing she'll ever do." The depth of her commitment surprised him. This was not the frightened girl he had rescued from the auction block. The experiences of recent weeks had forged her into something stronger, more determined. "There's something else," she said, hesitating slightly. "The dreams have started again." "What dreams?" "I see things. Battles that haven't happened yet. People I don't recognize making choices that will affect us all. Last night, I dreamed of a crown made of light and a choice between love and duty that would determine the fate of kingdoms." Ronan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The oracle mentioned a choice. She said when the time came, I would have to choose not with my crown, but with my heart. "Then we're both being prepared for something," Elira said softly. "The question is whether we'll be ready when the time comes." As night settled over Valdris, both the king and the girl he had rescued found themselves looking toward an uncertain future bound together by ancient prophecy and growing affection, while enemies, both within and without the kingdom, prepared to test their resolve in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The war room of Valdris Castle had witnessed countless strategic discussions over the centuries, but none quite like the one that took place 3 weeks after the poison attempt. The ancient war council map dominated the massive oak table, its surface marked with the blood-red stains of previous campaigns and bordered by the carved representations of mythical beasts that were said to protect the kingdom. Ronan stood at the head of the table, his fingers tracing the known positions of enemy forces along the northern border. Reports from his scouts painted an increasingly troubling picture. King Mortius of Drakmor was indeed mobilizing his armies, using training exercises as cover for what appeared to be preparation for invasion. "The numbers are concerning, Your Majesty," reported Captain Willem, the kingdom's most experienced military commander. 3,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and siege equipment being moved toward our border under the guise of seasonal maneuvers. Marcus studied the map with the eye of someone who had participated in military campaigns for over 2 decades. Mortius is ambitious, but he's not foolish. He wouldn't risk open warfare without believing he had a significant advantage. Something has changed his calculations. "Word of the strange events here has spread," Ronan acknowledged grimly. "Rumors have a way of growing in the telling. By the time they reach Drakmor, they probably include tales of madness and magical chaos in the capital." Duke Aldrich, despite his growing opposition to the king's policies, remained a member of the War Council due to his family's military traditions. He leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Perhaps we should consider whether these rumors have some basis. In fact, the court has been unsettled since that girl's arrival, and now we face external threats that coincide suspiciously with her presence." "Are you suggesting the young lady is somehow responsible for Mortius's aggression?" Captain Willem asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm suggesting that weakness invites attack," Aldrich replied sharply. "A king who allows sentiment to cloud. His judgment appears vulnerable to his enemies. Mortius sees opportunity in our distraction." Ronan's voice, when he spoke, carried the cold authority that had once made him legendary on the battlefield. "My judgment is not in question here, Duke Aldrich. What is in question is how we respond to a legitimate external threat without allowing internal divisions to weaken our response." The rebuke was clear, but Aldrich was too invested in his position to retreat. "Your Majesty, with respect, the kingdom needs clarity of purpose. If we're to face war, we need our allies to trust in our strength and stability. The current situation raises questions." "The current situation," interrupted Marcus, "is that enemy forces are massing on our border while we debate domestic policy. Perhaps we could focus on the immediate military threat." Captain Willem cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may, Your Majesty, regardless of the political considerations, our defensive position is strong. The mountain passes limit Mortius's approach options, and our fortifications have been well maintained. However, A prolonged siege could be problematic if our people lose faith in leadership stability. It was a careful way of acknowledging Aldrich's concerns without directly supporting them. Ronan appreciated the captain's diplomatic skills, but he also understood the underlying message. Military strength alone would not be sufficient if political unity crumbled. What do our intelligence sources tell us about Morteus's ultimate objectives? Ronan asked, steering the discussion back to tactical matters. He's been making overtures to the southern kingdoms, Marcus reported, suggesting that Valdris has become unreliable as an ally, hinting at internal chaos that makes us a poor partner for trade agreements. If he can isolate us diplomatically before attacking militarily, our options become significantly limited. The implications were sobering. Valdris had maintained its independence through a combination of military strength and careful diplomatic balance. If neighboring kingdoms began to view them as unstable, the political isolation could be more damaging than any military defeat. There's something else, Captain Willem added reluctantly. Our sources suggest that Morteus has been in contact with certain elements within our own court. We don't have specifics, but there are indications of correspondence. The room fell, silent. The possibility of treason within the nobility was always present, but rarely discussed so directly. Ronan's eyes moved around the table, studying each face for signs of guilt or nervousness. "I want names," he said quietly, "and I want evidence. If there are traitors in this court, they will be dealt with according to law." "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded dignity, "surely you don't suspect those of us who have served your family for generations. Some of us remember when this kingdom's strength came from unity of purpose, rather than mysterious prophecies and magical claims. I suspect anyone who puts personal agenda above kingdom security," Ronan replied evenly. "And I'm beginning to question whether some members of this council have forgotten what loyalty means." The tension in the room was palpable. Years of accumulated resentments and political differences were crystallizing into something that threatened the very unity they needed to face external threats. Marcus, recognizing the danger, intervened smoothly. "Perhaps we should focus on specific military preparations. Captain Willem, what reinforcements do you need for the border fortifications?" 200 additional men-at-arms, supplies for a siege of at least 3 months, and authority to conscript additional workers for fortification improvements. Willem replied promptly, grateful for the return to practical matters. "Granted," Ronan said immediately. "What else?" "Communication with our allied kingdoms," Marcus suggested. "We need to counter Morteus's diplomatic offensive with our own outreach. Assurances of stability, offers of continued partnership, perhaps even invitations for diplomatic visits to demonstrate that the kingdom remains strong and unified." It was a good suggestion, but Ronan knew it carried risks. Diplomatic visitors would witness firsthand the unusual phenomena surrounding Elira, and there was no guarantee that such exposure would support their claims of stability. "We'll need to be selective about timing," he said carefully. "Until certain domestic situations stabilize," Aldrich seized on the admission. "You see, we're already limiting our diplomatic options because of complications that could have been avoided entirely. We're being cautious because the situation is complex," Ronan corrected firmly, "and complexity requires careful handling, not rash decisions made in panic." The meeting continued for another hour, covering supply logistics, troop deployments, and communication strategies. But underneath the tactical discussions, the fundamental tension remained, a kingdom facing external threat while wrestling with internal division, all centered around a pregnant girl whose very presence had become a symbol of either hope or chaos, depending on one's perspective. As the council dispersed, Marcus lingered behind with Ronan, studying the ancient map with its blood-stained markings. "Morteus isn't wrong about one thing," Marcus said quietly. "This kingdom does face internal instability. The question is whether we can resolve it before it becomes fatal weakness. The instability existed before Elira arrived, Ronan replied. Her presence has simply forced it into the open, where it can be addressed, or where it can destroy us, Marcus countered gently. I support your decision to protect the girl, but we need to be realistic about the costs. If this prophecy is real, if her child truly can break the curse, then the timing becomes critical. We need resolution before our enemies can exploit our divisions. Ronan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the map's representation of enemy positions. Then we'd better pray that ancient magic works faster than modern politics. Outside the war room, Duke Valdris made his way through the castle corridors with purpose. In his chambers, a coded message waited to be sent, its recipient a contact in King Mortius's court, who had been extremely interested in recent developments in Valdris. The game had moved beyond simple court politics. The stakes now involved the survival of kingdoms, and Valdris had already chosen his side. The memory mirror had hung in the castle's library for centuries, its silver surface reflecting not just the present, but glimpses of the past for those who knew how to look. Most scholars dismissed it as an elaborate piece of art, noting its exquisite craftsmanship while remaining blind to its true nature. But on the night following the War Council meeting, as Elira wandered the library unable to sleep, the mirror began to show her visions that would change everything. It started as a shimmer across the polished surface, like heat waves rising from summer stone. Then images began to form, scenes from decades past, showing previous queens of Valdris in their final moments, each dying in childbirth or shortly after, their newborn heirs lasting mere days before succumbing to the curse that had plagued the royal line. But these weren't random historical glimpses. The mirror showed her something specific, something that made her heart race with understanding. Each of the cursed queens had been chosen for political alliance, women of noble birth who carried bloodlines acceptable to the court, but lacking in any connection to the old magic that had once protected the kingdom. "You see it too," came a voice from behind her. Elira spun around to find an elderly woman she didn't recognize, dressed in the simple robes of a castle scribe, but carrying herself with the dignity of nobility. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb anything," Elira stammered, stepping away from the mirror. "I couldn't sleep and thought perhaps reading might help." The woman smiled kindly, moving closer to examine the mirror's surface, which had returned to normal. "I am Lady Morwen, keeper of the royal archives, and you are seeing things in the mirror because you have the sight, child. The same gift that once protected this kingdom before politics and pride drove it away." "The sight?" Elira repeated, unconsciously touching the moonstone pendant at her throat. "The ability to see beyond the veil of present reality, to witness the threads that connect past, present, and future. It runs in certain bloodlines, old bloodlines that predate the current noble houses by centuries." Lady Morwen moved to one of the library's locked cabinets, producing an ancient key. "There are records here that even the king doesn't know exist. Documents that explain why the curse began and what would be required to end it." From the cabinet, she withdrew a leather-bound tome, so old its pages seemed to glow with their own inner light. The curse was not random divine punishment, as most believe. It was a deliberate working of dark magic, cast by a rival kingdom 3 centuries ago when Valdris first began to rise to prominence. But the curse had a specific weakness built into it, one that the enemy believed would never be exploited. Elira found herself drawn forward despite her fear. What kind of weakness? The curse could only be broken by a child born of 2 bloodlines, royal and magical. But the enemy knew that the royal family had abandoned the old ways, had married only for political advantage, systematically breeding the magical bloodlines out of the nobility. They thought themselves safe. The implications hit Elira like a physical blow. "You're saying that my bloodline is older than any of the current noble houses," Lady Morwen confirmed gently. "Your mother may have sold you for silver, But she couldn't sell what runs in your veins. The blood of the ancient guardians, the magic that once protected this kingdom before it was forgotten in favor of steel and gold. Elira sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed. But the king isn't the father of my child. How can royal blood be involved if... Blood isn't only passed through birth, child. It can be shared through other bonds. Bonds of love, of protection, of absolute commitment. When King Ronan chose to claim your child as his own heir, when he gave you his mother's pendant and swore to protect you both, he began a magical bonding that transcends physical parentage. The memory mirror shimmered again, this time showing Elira a vision of the future, a child with her green eyes and hair that seemed to catch light like spun gold, wearing a crown that blazed with power, standing beside a man who could only be an older version of Ronan. But there's a price, Lady Morwen continued, her expression growing solemn. The curse cannot be broken without sacrifice. Someone must pay the cost for 3 centuries of magical debt. The mirror shows many possible futures, but in all of them, someone loses everything so that the kingdom can be free. Who? Elira whispered, though she feared she already knew the answer. That depends on the choices made when the moment comes. The sacrifice could be the king's crown and power. It could be your life and the normal future you might have had, or it could be something else entirely, something none of us can foresee. That night, Elira lay awake long past midnight, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. The child she carried wasn't just special. It was the key to breaking a curse that had been deliberately cast by enemies who had sought to destroy the kingdom from within. But the cost of that freedom remained terrifyingly unclear. Meanwhile, in his own chambers, Ronan was experiencing visions of his own. As he slept, his dreams filled with images of battles yet to be fought, choices yet to be made, and a love that would either save his kingdom or destroy it. He saw himself standing at a crossroads where every path led to loss, where the crown he had worn with such burden might finally be lifted from his shoulders. But only through sacrifices he wasn't sure he had the courage to make. In these dreams, Elira appeared not as the frightened girl he had rescued, but as a woman of power in her own right, her green eyes blazing with ancient authority as she faced down enemies both magical and mundane. He saw their child, not as his biological offspring, but as something far more significant, the bridge between 2 worlds, the living symbol of love triumphing over political calculation. But he also saw darkness, forces gathering that would test every bond they had forged, every trust they had built. The price of breaking the curse would be paid in ways that would challenge the very foundations of what it meant to rule, what it meant to love, and what it meant to choose the future over the past. When morning came, both Ronan and Elira found themselves changed by their nocturnal revelations. They had entered a new phase of their relationship, no longer king and rescued subject, but 2 people bound by destiny and approaching choices that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of the entire kingdom. The supernatural signs around the castle continued to intensify. The healing crystal now pulsed in rhythm with Elira's heartbeat, even when she was in different rooms. Gardens bloomed out of season wherever she walked. Even the ancient stones of the castle walls seemed to respond to her presence, growing warmer to the touch and somehow more solid, as if the very structure was being strengthened by magic it hadn't felt for centuries. But with each manifestation of power came greater danger. Duke Aldrich's correspondence with Drakmor had intensified, and other nobles were beginning to choose sides. The kingdom was dividing itself between those who saw Elira as salvation and those who viewed her as a threat to the established order. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether ancient magic could triumph over modern treachery, whether love could prove stronger than political ambition, and whether a curse 3 centuries in the making could finally be broken by 2 people brave enough to risk everything for a future neither of them could fully understand. The discovery came at dawn, when Lady Morwen arrived at Elira's chambers with the ancestral bloodline scroll, a document she had spent 3 days authenticating through ancient magical means. Her face was pale with the weight of what she had uncovered, and her hands trembled as she unrolled the parchment across the table where the healing crystal pulsed with agitated light. "Child," she said quietly, "we must speak of truths that will change everything you believe about yourself, about your past, and about why you were truly brought to this castle." Elira, now 7 months pregnant and showing the full bloom of expectant motherhood, settled carefully into a chair. The moonstone pendant at her throat had begun to glow more frequently, and she had noticed that her dreams had become vivid prophecies that often came to pass within days. "I've been having dreams about my mother," Elira said slowly. "Different dreams than before. In them, she doesn't seem like the desperate woman who sold me. She seems like someone playing a role, someone following a plan I didn't understand." Lady Morwen nodded grimly, because that's exactly what she was doing. "Look here." She pointed to a section of the scroll where 2 genealogical lines converged. "This is your true lineage, traced back through church records and magical documentation that predates the current noble system." Elira leaned forward, studying the intricate family tree drawn in multiple hands across centuries. Her name appeared at the bottom of one line, but as she traced it upward, her breath caught in her throat. "This says I'm descended from Queen Lorelei, the wise," she whispered. "But that's impossible. She died 300 years ago, and she was the last queen to successfully bear a living heir before the curse took hold," Lady Morwen finished. "And more than that, she was the most powerful magical practitioner ever to sit on the throne of Valdris. Her bloodline was the one the enemies sought to eliminate when they cast the curse. But if that's true, why was I living in poverty? Why? Didn't anyone know?" Lady Morwen turned to another section of the scroll, where careful notations in multiple languages revealed a story of deliberate concealment spanning centuries. Because Queen Lorelei, in her final act before the curse claimed her, arranged for one of her children to disappear from court records. She saw what was coming, the systematic destruction of magical bloodlines, and she hid that child away, erasing all traces of royal connection while ensuring the bloodline would survive. The implications were staggering. Elira stared at the document, her mind struggling to process the revelation. "You're telling me that my mother, that the woman who sold me, knew who I really was?" "More than that," Lady Morwen said, producing a sealed letter from within the scroll's protective covering. She was following instructions left by Queen Lorelei herself, instructions that have been passed down through 30 generations of your family. Your sale to King Ronan was not betrayal, child. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy 3 centuries in the making. With shaking hands, Elira broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was new, but the words it contained were clearly copied from much older sources. "To my daughter's daughter's daughter, when the time of choosing comes, know that every hardship has been necessary, every sorrow has served purpose. The king who will claim you is the one foretold, the ruler whose heart will prove greater than his crown. Trust in his protection, for he will need your power to break what was broken long ago. The child you carry will bridge 2 worlds, but only if you have courage to sacrifice the life you thought you wanted for the destiny you were born to fulfill. Your mother's apparent betrayal is her greatest act of love. Forgive her, as I hope. You will forgive me for the burdens I have placed upon you. Queen Lorelei, last of the true line." Tears rolled down Elira's cheeks as the full scope of the deception became clear. Her mother's cold eyes, counting silver coins, hadn't been greed. They had been the grief of a woman doing what she believed necessary to save her daughter and the kingdom, even knowing her daughter would hate her for it. "There's more," Lady Morwen said gently. "Look at this section of King Ronan's genealogy." She pointed to another area of the scroll where Ronan's family tree was traced back through the Same centuries. At several points, the lines intersected with Elira's ancestry in ways that made the magical bonding between them not just possible, but inevitable. Your distant cousins, Lady Morwen explained, separated by centuries and deliberate concealment, but connected by blood that carries both royal authority and ancient magic. When he claimed your child as his heir, when he swore to protect you both, he was fulfilling bonds that existed long before either of you was born. The Oracle knew, Elira realized suddenly. When she spoke of choices between crown and heart, she knew that Ronan would have to choose between his duty as king and his role in breaking the curse. And she knew that you would have to choose between a quiet life of anonymity and accepting the responsibilities of your true heritage. The child you carry isn't just the heir to break the curse, it's the rightful ruler of both bloodlines, the first legitimate heir to the throne in 3 centuries. The weight of destiny settled around Elira like a heavy cloak. Everything she had believed about herself, about her circumstances, about the random cruelty that had brought her to the castle, had been part of an elaborate plan centuries in the making. She was not a victim who had been rescued. She was a queen returning to claim her birthright, but even as the truth empowered her, it also revealed the full scope of the danger they faced. If Duke Aldrich or King Morteus learned of her true lineage, they would understand that she represented not just a magical threat to their plans, but a legitimate political challenge to any claims they might have on Valdris's throne. Who else knows about this? She asked. As of now, only you and I, Lady Morwen replied. But secrets of this magnitude don't remain hidden forever, and there are signs that others are beginning to piece together parts of the truth. As if summoned by their conversation, urgent knocking sounded at the chamber door. Marcus entered without waiting for permission, his face grim with news. "Lady Elira, you need to come with me immediately. His Majesty requests your presence in the throne room. Duke Aldrich has made formal accusations before the assembled court." "What kind of accusations?" Lady Morwen asked sharply. "He claims she's a foreign agent sent to destabilize the kingdom through witchcraft and deception. He's demanding she be arrested and tried for treason." Elira stood slowly, her hand moving protectively to her belly. The child within her seemed to sense the tension, moving restlessly as if preparing for battle. The moonstone pendant blazed with light so intense it was visible even in the daylight streaming through the windows. "Then it's time," she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority that made both Marcus and Lady Morwen take notice. "If Duke Aldrich wants to force a confrontation, then he'll get one, but he has no idea what he's truly challenging." As they made their way through the corridors toward the throne room, Elira felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold at auction. She was Queen Lyrale's heir, carrying not just a child, but the accumulated power and responsibility of her bloodline. The time for hiding, for pretending to be less than she was, had come to an end. The curse that had plagued Valdris for 3 centuries was about to face its greatest test, and the outcome would depend on whether a king could choose love over tradition, whether a hidden queen could embrace her destiny, and whether 2 people bound by ancient magic could stand together against forces that sought to destroy everything they were meant to protect. The final act was beginning, and there would be no retreat from the choices that lay ahead. The throne room of Valdris had never felt more like a battlefield than it did on the morning when Duke Aldrich chose to force his hand. The great hall was packed with nobles, court officials, and witnesses, their faces reflecting the tension that had been building for months. At the center of it all sat King Ronan, the crown of thorns upon his head, his expression carved from granite, as he prepared for a confrontation that would determine the fate of his kingdom. Duke Aldrich stood in the center of the hall, flanked by 3 other nobles whose families had grown increasingly dissatisfied with the king's recent decisions. His voice carried clearly through the vaulted space as he made his accusations. "Your Majesty, I stand before you and this assembled court to speak truths that can no longer be ignored. The woman you have sheltered in this castle is not what she appears to be. She is an agent of dark forces, sent to corrupt and weaken our kingdom through supernatural manipulation. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces showed agreement with Aldrich's words, while others displayed skepticism or outright disagreement. The court was as divided as Ronan had feared. "These are serious accusations, Duke Aldrich," Ronan said, his voice level but carrying an undertone of warning. "I trust you have evidence to support such claims." "I have witnessed the unnatural phenomena that follow her presence," Aldrich replied, confidently. "Gardens blooming out of season, servants reporting strange lights and sounds, prophecies and magic that have no place in a Christian kingdom. And now word comes that enemy forces mass on our borders, drawn by reports of our internal chaos." The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Elira entered, flanked by Marcus and Lady Morwen. Her pregnancy was evident, but she carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. The moonstone pendant at her throat glowed softly, and those sensitive to such things could feel the power that radiated from her presence. "Since you speak of me, Duke Aldrich," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "perhaps I should be present to respond to your accusations." Her composure surprised many in the assembled court. This was not the frightened girl who had been brought to the castle months ago. There was authority in her bearing, wisdom in her eyes that seemed older than her 18 years. "You see," Aldrich gestured dramatically, "even now she displays unnatural confidence, as if she knows herself protected by forces beyond our understanding." I'm protected," Elira said calmly, "by the truth, by ancient right, and by bonds that predate your family's presence in this kingdom." The statement sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. What did she mean by ancient right? Lady Morwen stepped forward, carrying the ancestral bloodline scroll. "If the court will permit," Lady Morwen announced, "I have documentation that bears directly on these proceedings." Duke Aldrich's eyes narrowed. "More magic and mysticism? We need facts, not fairy tales." "Facts are exactly what I offer," Lady Morwen replied, beginning to unroll the ancient scroll. "Facts about bloodlines and legitimacy that some in this court might find uncomfortable." Ronan recognized the danger in the moment. Once Elira's true heritage was revealed, it would change the political landscape entirely. But there was no turning back now. The truth would have to be faced, regardless of the consequences. "Proceed, Lady Morwen," he commanded. "This scroll documents the genealogy of the royal house of Valdris, traced through magical and mundane records, spanning 7 centuries. She pointed to specific sections as she spoke. "It shows that Lady Elira is not a commoner rescued from unfortunate circumstances. She is the direct descendant of Queen Lorelei the Wise, the last queen to successfully bear a living heir before the curse took hold." The revelation hit the court like a physical blow. Voices rose in shock, disbelief, and in some cases, recognition of what this meant for existing power structures. "Moreover," Lady Morwen continued, raising her voice above the commotion, "the scroll shows that King Ronan and Lady Elira share common ancestry, making their magical bonding not just possible, but prophetically mandated. The child she carries is not a bastard to be legitimized by royal decree. It is the rightful heir to the throne by blood, magic, and ancient law." Duke Aldrich's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "Convenient documents can be forged. Ancient prophecies can be fabricated. What cannot be disputed is that this woman's presence has brought instability to our kingdom and enemies to our borders." "The enemies were always coming," Marcus interjected, his voice carrying the authority. "Of years of military intelligence. Your correspondence with agents of Drakmor predates Lady Elira's arrival by months. You have been working to undermine this kingdom's stability long before she gave you an excuse to do so openly." The accusation of treason brought absolute silence to the hall. Duke Aldrich's expression shifted from confident accusation to desperate defensiveness. "I have maintained correspondence with many courts," he said carefully. "Diplomacy requires communication with potential allies and enemies alike. Diplomacy does not require passing information about internal castle security," Marcus countered grimly. "Nor does it require advance notice of military weaknesses and political divisions." Ronan stood from his throne, the dragon-forged sword at his side seeming to pulse with inner light. The blade had been reforged in recent days, incorporating elements that Lady Morwen had assured him would be necessary for the trials ahead. Steel enhanced with metals that responded to magical energy, runes carved along the fuller that glowed in the presence of supernatural power. "Duke Aldrich," Ronan's voice carried the full weight of royal authority, "you stand accused of treason against the crown, conspiracy with enemy forces, and deliberate destabilization of the kingdom during a time of external threat. How do you answer these charges?" "I answer that I have served this kingdom's true interests while you have been bewitched by supernatural nonsense and romantic fantasy," Aldrich replied defiantly. "A king who abandons duty for sentiment is no king at all, and a duke who betrays his oath of loyalty for personal advancement deserves no mercy," Ronan countered. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of horns from the castle's watchtowers, the signal for approaching armies. Captain Willem burst into the hall, his face urgent with news. "Your Majesty, Mortius's forces have crossed the border. 3,000 infantry, siege equipment and advanced cavalry are moving toward the capital. They'll be here within 2 days." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Aldrich had clearly coordinated with Drakmor to ensure that external pressure would support his internal coup attempt. "Guards," Ronan commanded, "arrest Duke Aldrich and his co-conspirators on charges of high treason." "You make a mistake, Your Majesty," Aldrich said as the guards moved to apprehend him. "The nobles of this kingdom will not follow a king who chooses magic over reason, prophecy over prudence. When Mortius arrives, he'll find a kingdom ready to accept new leadership." As the conspirators were led away, Ronan turned to address the remaining court. Many faces showed uncertainty, fear of the approaching army mixed with confusion about the revelations regarding Elira's heritage. "My lords and ladies," he said, his voice carrying both authority and appeal, "we face a choice that will define not just our immediate survival, but the character of our kingdom for generations to come. We can cling to old prejudices and political calculations while our enemies destroy us from without, or we can embrace the truth that has been revealed and find strength in unity. The truth is that prophecy and politics make poor bedfellows," called out Lord Garrett, one of the older nobles. "Even if Lady Elira is descended from ancient queens, that doesn't mean her child can break a curse that has held for 3 centuries. "Then let us put it to the test," Elira said, stepping forward. The moonstone pendant at her throat was blazing now, and the very air around her seemed to shimmer with energy. "Let us see whether ancient magic can prove stronger than modern cynicism." She placed her hands over her swollen belly, and immediately the child within her began to move with unusual vigor. The movement was visible through her dress, and more than that, it seemed to pulse with light that grew brighter with each passing moment. "The child knows," Lady Morwen whispered in amazement. "It knows what's coming, and it's preparing." Throughout the hall, every piece of metal that contained even traces of the old magical alloys began to glow. Sword hilts, jewelry, decorative fixtures that had been crafted centuries ago when such materials were more readily available. The very stones of the castle walls grew warm to the touch, as if the ancient structure itself was awakening after centuries of sleep. "Impressive theatrics," came a voice from the hall's entrance. Everyone turned to see a figure in travel-stained diplomatic robes bearing the colors of Drakmor. "But King Mortius sent me ahead to offer terms for surrender, not to witness magical..." Exhibitions. The ambassador's presence confirmed what many had suspected. This was a coordinated attack, timed to coincide with internal division and designed to exploit the kingdom's perceived weakness. "What terms does your king offer?" Ronan asked, though his tone suggested he had no intention of accepting whatever was proposed. "Abdication in favor of a regent acceptable to Drakmor, marriage alliances to secure peace, and the immediate banishment of all practitioners of forbidden arts," the ambassador replied smoothly. "In return, the transition of power will be peaceful, and the common people will be spared the hardships of siege. And if we refuse, then your capital falls within the week, your nobles choose between death and exile, and your kingdom becomes a province of Drakmor." The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Around the hall, faces reflected the weight of impossible choices: surrender their independence or face almost certain military defeat, accept foreign rule or watch their people suffer through siege and conquest. But Ronan was no longer the same man who had rescued a frightened girl from an auction block. Months of witnessing impossible things, of watching ancient magic awaken in response to love and courage, had changed his understanding of what was possible. "Tell your king," he said, drawing the dragon-forged sword in one smooth motion, "that Valdris chooses to stand on its own feet, protected by its own strength and guided by truths older than his ambition." The blade sang as it cleared its sheath, glowing with power that matched the energy radiating from Elira and her unborn child. The confrontation was no longer just political. It had become a battle between old magic and new conquest, between love and ambition, between the bonds that united people and the forces that sought to tear them apart. The siege of Valdris was about to begin, but it would be unlike any siege in the history of warfare. For the first time in 3 centuries, the ancient powers that had once protected the kingdom were awakening, and the curse that had weakened it was finally ready to be broken. The attack came at dawn on the 3rd day, just as the oracle had foretold in dreams that now haunted both Ronan and Elira. From the castle's highest tower, they could see Mortius's army spread across the valley like a dark stain against the green fields. 3,000 soldiers in perfect formation, siege engines rolling forward with mechanical precision, and banners that snapped in the morning wind like hungry tongues. But something else was happening in the pre-dawn darkness, something that no military manual had ever described. The Phoenix Egg, an artifact that Lady Morwen had retrieved from the deepest vaults of the castle, had begun to crack. Not from damage, but from the pressure of something trying to emerge from within. It sat on a pedestal in the castle's great hall, glowing with increasing intensity as hairline fractures spread across its crystalline surface. "It's responding to the child," Lady Morwen explained to those gathered around the ancient relic. "The prophecy speaks of rebirth and renewal, of breaking chains that have bound generations. The egg represents that transformation." Elira stood as close to the artifact as she could manage, her hands pressed against her belly, where the child had been moving almost constantly since the enemy army's arrival. The moonstone pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with both the Phoenix Egg and her own heartbeat, creating a harmony of light that filled the hall with otherworldly beauty. "How long before the child comes?" Ronan asked the physician, though his eyes remained fixed on the approaching army. "Soon, Your Majesty. Very soon. The labor pains have begun, though she bears them with remarkable strength." Indeed, Elira had refused to retreat to her chambers, despite the obvious signs that birth was imminent. "This child will be born free," she had declared, "not hidden away while others fight for its future." Captain Willem approached with the final military reports. "The walls are as strong as we can make them, but we're outnumbered 5 to 1. If they focus their assault on the main gate, we might hold for days, but not weeks." "We won't need weeks," Ronan replied, though he wasn't entirely certain what made him so confident. "Whatever's going to happen will happen soon." The first volley of arrows darkened the sky like a storm cloud, followed by the thunderous crash. of siege engines beginning their assault on the castle's outer defenses. But as the projectiles struck the ancient walls, something unprecedented occurred. The stones themselves began to glow with the same inner light that emanated from the phoenix egg, and many of the arrows simply bounced off harmlessly. "The old magic is awakening," Marcus breathed, watching in amazement as the castle's defenses strengthened themselves through supernatural means. The very stones remember what they were built to do. In the great hall, Elira gasped as a powerful contraction seized her. The phoenix egg's glow intensified dramatically, and throughout the castle, every piece of metal touched by ancient craftsmanship began to sing, a harmonic resonance that grew stronger with each wave of labor. "Your Majesty," one of the guards called from the battlements, "you need to see this." Ronan made his way to the walls, where an impossible sight awaited him. The enemy army had halted its advance, not from strategic considerations, but because the ground itself had begun to glow. Patterns of light were emerging from the earth, ancient protective circles that had been carved into the landscape centuries ago and forgotten by all but the oldest legends. King Morteus won't be able to advance, Captain Willem realized. The protective barriers are activating. His army is trapped outside the circle until another cry from Elira echoed through the castle, and the phoenix egg cracked further, light beginning to spill from the widening fissures like molten gold. "Until the birth is complete," Lady Morwen finished. "The old magic is holding them back, giving us the time we need." But even as supernatural forces protected the castle, Ronan faced the most difficult choice of his life. His place was on the battlements, directing the defense of his kingdom. But every instinct he possessed demanded that he be with Elira during the most dangerous and important moments of her life. "Go to her," Marcus said quietly, having read the conflict in his king's expression. "I can coordinate the defenses. A place is with your family." The word hit Ronan with unexpected force. Family. For 15 years, he had ruled alone, convinced that the curse would never allow him the luxury of personal connections. But now, as enemy armies pressed against magical barriers and an ancient prophecy approached its fulfillment, he realized that he had found something worth more than any crown. He reached the great hall, just as another powerful contraction seized. Elira. The phoenix egg was blazing now, its light so intense that it cast sharp shadows, despite the daylight streaming through the windows. And in that light, Ronan could see something that made his breath catch in his throat, the faintest outline of wings beginning to unfurl within the cracking shell. "The rebirth begins," Lady Morwen announced, her voice filled with wonder. 3 Centuries of curse and shadow are about to end, but the final test is yet to come. Outside, King Morteus's army pressed against barriers of light that grew stronger with each passing moment, while inside the castle, ancient magic and mortal love combined to create something that would change the world forever. The phoenix egg. Shattered at the exact moment Elira's child drew its first breath. Light exploded through the great hall with such intensity that everyone present was momentarily blinded. When their vision cleared, they saw something that would be remembered in legend for 1,000 years, a newborn child whose first cry had broken not just the silence, but the very foundations of the curse that had plagued Valdris for 3 centuries. The infant was perfect in every way, with Elira's green eyes and hair that seemed to catch and hold light like spun gold. But more than that, the child radiated power that was immediately evident to everyone present. Where the phoenix egg had stood, there now rested a new artifact, the crown of unity, forged from the crystalline remains and glowing with power that pulsed in harmony with the newborn's heartbeat. "The curse is broken," Lady Morwen whispered, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the fulfillment of prophecies she had studied for decades. For the first time in 300 years, an heir of Valdris lives and thrives. But even as they celebrated this miracle, the battle outside intensified. The protective barriers that had held Morteus's army at bay were weakening now that their purpose was fulfilled. The child was born, the curse was broken, but the kingdom still faced earthly enemies who would not be deterred by magic alone. Ronan held his son, for in his heart this was his child regardless of blood, and felt something fundamental shift within him. The weight of the crown, the burden of solitary rule, the isolation that had defined his life for 15 years, all of it fell away, replaced by a fierce protectiveness and love that gave him strength he had never known he possessed. "Captain Willem," he called, his voice carrying new authority. "What is our situation?" "The barriers are fading, Your Majesty. Morteus's army will reach our walls within the hour. But there's something else. Our own forces are reporting strange effects. Weapons that were dulled by age are sharp again. Armor that was weakened by time has regained its strength. It's as if the breaking of the curse has renewed everything, connected to the kingdom's defense. Indeed, throughout Valdris, the effects of the curse's end were becoming apparent. Crops that had struggled for generations were suddenly thriving. Wells that had run low were flowing freely. Even the people themselves seemed renewed, as if a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying had been lifted from their shoulders. "And the enemy?" Ronan asked, gently placing the crown of unity on his head. The artifact fitted perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for him, and immediately he felt his connection to the kingdom deepen and strengthen. "Confused and afraid," Captain Willem reported with satisfaction. "Half their force is talking about retreating. They came expecting to find a weakened kingdom torn by internal strife. Instead, they're facing something they don't understand." Elira, exhausted but glowing with the contentment of successful motherhood, looked up from where she cradled their child. "Morteus didn't just come for conquest," she said, her voice weak but certain. "He came because he was promised an easy victory by those who wanted to see both our kingdoms fall." Duke Aldrich, Marcus confirmed grimly, his correspondence with Drakmor was part of a larger conspiracy. There are forces that profit from chaos between kingdoms, merchants and nobles who benefit when established powers war against each other. The realization that they faced not just military conquest, but deliberate destabilization, changed the nature of their response. This wasn't simply about defending their borders, it was about exposing and defeating a conspiracy that threatened the stability of multiple realms. "Then it's time to end this," Ronan declared, rising from where he had knelt beside Elira. The dragon-forged sword at his side was singing now, its magical enhancements responding to the crown of Unity's power. Not just the siege, but the entire conspiracy that brought it about. He strode to the great hall's main balcony, which overlooked the courtyard and could be seen from the main gate. Below, his people had gathered, soldiers and civilians alike, all looking to their king for guidance in this unprecedented moment. "People of Valdris," Ronan called, his voice enhanced by the crown's magic so that it carried clearly to every corner of the courtyard and beyond. "Today we face enemies who thought to find us weak and divided. They were wrong on both counts." He held up his son, the child whose birth had broken the curse and renewed the kingdom's strength. "The bloodline of Valdris continues, stronger than it has been in 3 centuries. The curse that weakened us is broken. The magic that once protected. Our realm has awakened. We stand united, renewed, and ready to defend what is ours." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, growing stronger as it spread through the castle and beyond. On the walls, soldiers raised their weapons and found them blazing with inner light. In the courtyard, civilians who had never held swords felt the call to defend their home with courage they had never known they possessed. Outside the barriers, Morteus's army hesitated as reports reached them of impossible things happening within the castle walls. Their easy conquest was becoming something else entirely. A confrontation with forces they were neither prepared for nor capable of understanding. The final battle was about to begin, but it would be fought on terms that no one could have predicted, between a kingdom reborn through love and sacrifice, and enemies who had underestimated the power of both magic and unity. 6 months after the siege that never was, the great hall of Valdris Castle hosted a celebration unlike any in the kingdom's history. The eternal flame burned brightly in its place of honor, a mystical fire that had ignited spontaneously on the day of Prince Lyran's birth and had never dimmed since. The flame served as a symbol of the enduring love between Ronan and Elira, and the hope that now illuminated their kingdom's future. What had happened in those final hours of confrontation had become the stuff of legend, though those who witnessed it still struggled to put the events into words that made sense to those who hadn't been there. When King Mortius's army finally breached the fading magical barriers, they found themselves facing not just soldiers and walls, but the very essence of Valdris itself, risen in defense of its people. The dragon-forged sword in Ronan's hands had blazed with power that turned aside enemy blades and shattered siege equipment with each swing. The kingdom's defenders fought with supernatural strength and coordination, as if the land itself guided their actions. But most remarkably, the enemy forces began to lay down their weapons, not from defeat, but from a growing understanding that they were fighting for a lie. Duke Aldrich's conspiracy had unraveled completely when Mortius himself, confronted with evidence of the larger plot, realized he had been manipulated into attacking a kingdom that posed no threat to his own realm. The merchants and nobles who had orchestrated the conflict fled when their scheme was exposed, leaving behind documentation that revealed similar conspiracies brewing between other kingdoms. Hard to believe it's all over, Marcus reflected, joining Ronan on the balcony where the king often came to watch the sunset. 6 months ago, we were preparing for siege and possible destruction. Now we're planning expansion of the royal library and new trade agreements with 5 neighboring kingdoms. Ronan smiled, his attention divided between Marcus's words and the sight below of Elira in the garden, holding their son while he reached chubby hands toward the flowers that seemed to bloom more brightly in his presence. The curse wasn't just on the royal bloodline, he said thoughtfully. It was on the kingdom itself, a gradual weakening that made us vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation we faced. Breaking it didn't just save my family, it saved everyone. The changes throughout Valdris had been dramatic and continuing. Crop yields had increased by 40%. Trade routes that had been unreliable for decades were flourishing again. Even the weather seemed to have improved, with gentle rains arriving precisely when needed and harsh storms moderating before they could cause damage. The oracle says the effects will continue for generations, Marcus noted, that Prince Lyran's children and grandchildren will grow up in a kingdom protected by the same magic that was nearly lost. And Lady Morwen believes we're not the only realm where such magic once existed, Ronan added. If the old protections can be restored elsewhere, perhaps the world will become a more stable place for everyone. The formal ceremony began as the sun reached its zenith. Nobles from across Valdris and representatives from allied kingdoms had gathered to witness Queen Elira's official coronation, an event that had been postponed for months to allow her to recover from childbirth and for the kingdom to stabilize after the dramatic events of the siege. She wore the crown of unity, which had been resized and modified to suit her, its crystalline structure catching and reflecting light in ways that seemed to defy natural law. The crown had become a symbol not just of royal authority, but of the unity between magical heritage and political necessity, between ancient wisdom and modern governance. Citizens of Valdris, Ronan announced to the assembled crowd, I present to you, Queen Elira, rightful heir to the bloodline of Queen Lorelei, protector of the ancient ways, and mother to the future of our kingdom. The cheers that greeted this proclamation came not just from duty or political necessity, but from genuine affection. In the months since Prince Lyran's birth, Elira had proven herself far more than just a magical bloodline or a pretty face. She had worked tirelessly to understand the needs of her people, had mediated disputes with wisdom that belied her years, and had used her growing understanding of the old magic to heal divisions within the kingdom that had festered for decades. "And I present to you Prince Lyran," she said, holding up the 6-month-old child who had already shown signs of remarkable development. First heir of Valdris to survive in 3 centuries, bridge between the old magic and the new age, and symbol of hope for all who call this kingdom home. The infant prince seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, reaching tiny hands toward the crowd and babbling sounds that somehow carried clearly through the hall. Where his attention focused, people reported feeling warmth and contentment, as if his very presence blessed them. Later that evening, as the formal celebrations wound down, Ronan and Elira found themselves alone with their son in the private chambers that had become their sanctuary. The healing crystal on the mantelpiece glowed softly, responding to their contentment, while the moonstone pendant, now set into a special holder so that Prince Lyran could play with it safely, cast gentle light around the room. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had gone differently?" Elira asked, cradling their son, while Ronan held them both. "If your compassion hadn't moved you to buy a pregnant girl at auction? If the oracle had never come? If the curse had never been broken?" "Sometimes," Ronan admitted, "but not with regret. Everything that happened, even the hardships and dangers, led us to this moment, led us to him." He touched his son's tiny hand, marveling at how something so small could have changed so much. "The oracle told me once that some destinies are written in the stars," Elira said softly. "But she also said that it takes courage to fulfill them. I'm glad we found that courage when we needed it most." Outside their window, the kingdom of Valdris settled into peaceful sleep under the protection of renewed magic and the promise of a future brighter than any they had dared to imagine. The eternal flame burned on in the great hall, a beacon of hope that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead, and in the royal chambers, a family born of prophecy and forged by love looked forward to the dawn of a new age.